Hello, everyone. I'm Dexter Marr, and I'll be your summer session moderator. Thank you for participating in the 46th Annual Buddhist Study Center Summer Session. The Buddhist Study Center of Hawaii opened its doors in 1972, inspired by then Bishop Kanmo Imamura and led by then BSC Director Reverend Tatsuo Mineto, who I think is in the audience tonight. So, hello, Reverend Mineto. The first summer session began 2 years later in 1973 with a 4-week course of study led by instructors Dr. Alfred Bloom and Dr. Mokusen Miyuki. The 2020 summer session is the first online version and offers the opportunity to share the teachings not only in Honolulu, but globally. For the past several years, the in-person classes have been augmented with live streaming primarily for our neighbor island sanghas. This year, through technology and the opportunity of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can share Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams' insights with a much broader audience. The technology we're using is a combination of YouTube and Skype, so viewers are in broadcast mode, like viewing a live TV program. The virtual studio is from Skype. So the only direct interaction from you, the audience, to Professor Williams is via the chat mode on YouTube. Please send your questions and comments via chat at any time, and we'll select questions from there during the questions and answers. The format for the evening will be about 40 minutes of presentation by Duncan, followed by about 15 minutes of questions and answers. Then a 10-minute break for home refreshment, stretching, etc., and then a repeat. This presentation will be immediately available on YouTube, so if you need to break away, portions of it or the entirety can be viewed at a later time. A full syllabus of homework is available at the BSC website, so you can prepare for each evening's subject in advance. Please bear with us at the Buddhist Study Center as we learn how to produce these types of educational programs and the technology required. We selected the YouTube Skype approach for your ease of connecting, as well as the reliable connection from the BSC studio. We'll begin our 2020 summer session with some words from our bishop, Reverend Eric Matsumoto. Bishop Matsumoto.
Thank you, Dexter. Aloha kako. Aloha to one and all. To everyone, as Dexter had mentioned earlier, from both near and far, welcome and thank you for joining us for the 46th Annual Buddhist Study Center Summer Session. It's truly unfortunate that we're not able to meet in person for summer session, but I am happy and most grateful that we're able to gather online to listen and learn from Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams. Sensei, aloha, and thank you for being our speaker this year. Some of us have had the pleasure of meeting you on your previous trips to Hawaii, but I hope tonight that many more people will be able to hear you and what you have to share with us. For myself, what you have to share us, including what is in your book, American Sutra, is not only important historically, but also very relevant to the two crises that we are facing currently with COVID-19 and also racism that our nation and world are facing right now as we gather. I'm sure we'll learn a lot, which will help us to move forward towards being a more harmonious world. And I thank you in advance for your insight and what you'll be sharing with us. I have to say that I am just amazed at the wealth of information and details that you're able to amass through your research and interviews that in your book. It's truly astonishing. I end by expressing my gratitude to you for sharing with us by agreeing to be our summer session speaker. And thank you to all the viewers tonight and for the next 4 nights too. Further thank you to Reverend Kunyuki and the staff and volunteers of Buddhist Study Center for your hard work and assistance. This would not be possible without you. Last but not least, let us express our gratitude to the Buddha Dharma for the guidance, inspiration, and assurance provided by all-inclusive wisdom and all-embracing compassion. I'd like to end my welcome message by asking everyone to please join me in Anjali Gasho to recite Namo Amida Butsu, which is the Buddha's name that calls us to entrust, and at the same time, the Buddha's name which we call in gratitude. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo
Namo
Amida
Amida
Butsu.
Butsu.
Namo
Namo
Amida
Namo
Amida
Amida Butsu.
Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu.
And may we go to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha for guidance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop. We are delighted to welcome Professor Williams back to Hawaii. Duncan's a frequent visitor to Hawaii, having participated in the 2014 Numata Conference hosted by UH Manoa and the Buddhist Study Center, the 2015 Bloom Futaba Memorial Lectures, and the American Sutra book tour last year. So aloha, welcome home. He is a professor of religion at the University of Southern California and director of the Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. Among his many published books and articles is the groundbreaking work, American Sutra, which will be featured in some of the lectures this week. In particular, Professor Williams will share little-known perspectives on Hawaii under martial law that could not be included in the final version of the book. This book is available at the Hawaii Hongwanji bookstore website, as well as the Buddhist Churches of America online bookstore, and of course, Amazon Books. Tonight's subject is called Interlinked, and it's found in your program. It's the Foundations of American Buddhism, and we'll explore the early history of American Buddhism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as established in Hawaii and the continental US by Asian immigrants and early converts. How was American Buddhism formed during its first several decades? So Duncan will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll follow with about 15 minutes of questions and answers. So, Professor Williams, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Dexter for that kind introduction, to the bishop for his kind remarks. I'd also like to thank Reverend Kunyuki and all of the members of the Buddhist Study Center and tech support. You know, I wish I could be there in Hawaii with you. My wife and I actually both had looked forward to visiting you in, of course, Honolulu, but also many of the other islands. And so it is unfortunate that we cannot see each other in person in the same room. But in this way, I named this week's theme Interlinked. And it's because I feel like even though we aren't able to physically be present with each other, we are still interlinked. And today I've heard that many different people from various communities on all of the islands and also from the mainland may be able to join us. And so I do feel interlinked with you. In a moment, I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint presentation, which will give you a little bit more of a sense of lectures of this week. Have this overarching thematic called Interlinked. But today, the focus is the foundations of American Buddhism. And so what I want to do is share with you this screen and maybe if the tech staff could assist me in sharing this screen so that I can talk through some visuals and slides, and just so that you don't have to listen to me for 2 solid hours without some other kinds of information than my voice. So one thing I wanted to just up top before I go into today's topic is to alert you to the fact that we do have 5 days of this interlinked sessions. And as Dexter mentioned, today's Foundations of American Buddhism, tomorrow is Buddhism in Hawaii during World War II, and then religious freedom in Buddhism, and American Buddhism and ecology, Buddhist social engagement in 2020, etc. So we're going to be using the prism of American Buddhism to, I hope, talk about many different topics. On each day, if you happen to receive notification about this seminar ahead of time and have been able to do some of the readings that were suggested or recommended, I do think it will help to supplement and enhance whatever I will say in terms of the lectures and presentations. My understanding, just one other kind of quick request or kind of a notation in terms of how we are going to try to do this interlinked summer seminar together in the different technological platforms we have, is that as Dexter mentioned, I'll try to speak in a relatively constrained manner. I'm not going to speak for 2 hours in a row. It'd be like 40 minutes and some minutes of your questions, take a break and repeat. But I believe that we're going to request that you type in any comments, questions, reflections in the YouTube channel, if you don't mind. And that way, your questions will come to me through the technological team that the Buddhist Study Center has put together. And I believe that Dexter, as the kind of MC of this seminar, will be able to kind of help transmit those questions and comments to me. So it's a big experiment. I hope it'll work. But you know what? American Buddhism itself is an experiment. And so I'm going to try to get into this topic this way. Now, I want to start today by relating to you a story of something that happened to something that occurred to me the other day. It was a couple years ago now, but it was an incident where I was approached by a couple of middle school YBA, or Young Buddhist Association, teenagers at a so-called YBA gathering here in Southern California. I was asked to, I think, be a keynote speaker at this gathering, and but it was not in the speech itself, but in the conversations that followed that I learned something. I think something very important about the nature of American Buddhism. Some of these, I think they were like maybe freshmen in high school or something like that, and they were younger, they were like teenagers, and they asked me about how to sum up what is Buddhism. They were like, at our school, we have so many friends who are not Buddhist. Many are evangelical Christians, and they ask us about maybe joining them for Bible study or going to Sunday's, church service and so on. And we have to explain that we're already, that we're Buddhist, and that it's not like we're, we don't have our own faith tradition. But they said, but sometimes it's hard to explain in a really kind of brief way what is Buddhism. And so they gave me a question, a koan, as it were, on the spot, and they were like, Professor Williams, if you have to sum up in a formula, like something that's easy to like remember and easy to explain to other people about what is Buddhism, what would that formula be? And I was kind of like taken aback by that, because usually I don't reduce things to formulas, but what came out of my mouth was wisdom times compassion equals freedom. I think that might be short enough to remember. After that incident, I've been often thinking about like what came out of my mouth in that moment and trying to think about why I said that and how it might or might not be appropriate in an American context. I think I used the word freedom because I think in America, nobody is like, boo freedom. Like nobody's anti-freedom. And in general, the goal of Buddhism is to alleviate and reduce suffering in our personal lives and in our world, and become, liberated or free from that. But I thought, and sometimes we use the word awakening or enlightenment or other kinds of words to talk about jōbutsu, the idea of accomplishing Buddhahood, the kind of ideal image of what it means to release delusion and release ego-centeredness. In Japanese, we use the word jōbutsu, which of course literally means accomplishing, Buddhahood as a kind of like aim of Buddhism. But I thought the word freedom is a appropriate term for American Buddhism to capture the spirit of it, and that to get to freedom, to get to a point where we release the things that cause us suffering, right? That there's many things that cause us suffering, both mental and physical and individual and communal. But the two things that really stick out are, ignorance, when we're ignorant of things, and our self-centeredness. And these two things, especially when they're combined, cause great suffering. So that's something we know. And we know that the Buddha taught an antidote or a medicine to that. And to cure delusion, he gave us many, many tools of wisdom. And to cure the self-centeredness, he gave us many tools of compassion. And so I was thinking about this formula and this week's thematic of interlinked. And I began to think about what I should say at the top for our 5 days together, and why interlinked, why beyond the kind of fact that we're separated physically, how can we be connected in a different way as a Sangha in this kind of platform of YouTube and so forth. It may reminded me of this basic image or metaphor, Indra no mo, this jeweled net of Indra. And I'm not 100%, since I'm not 100% certain who's listening today, and there might be some of you who may or may not be familiar with that metaphor, I thought maybe I'd explain it a little bit as the kind of frame I want to use for everything I talk about this week. So the jeweled net of Indra is an image that comes from the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's a very important sutra or scripture in the East Asian Mahayana tradition, and central to, for example, the Kegon school of Buddhism in Japan. And one of the central images and teachings of this text is about how we should understand the nature of our world. And the basic image that's given is of this infinite net. I like to think about it as if it, those like tennis court nets that have these little knots in them. It's one of those, but extended not two-dimensionally, but in every dimension. It extends infinitely. And in each knot, the notion is that there is a jewel that represents each one of us, but a jewel that is cut in such a way that it looks polished in such a way that it seems like it's a mirror or a lens. And the basic idea of the jeweled net of Indra is that our universe exists in this kind of realm of the Indic deity Indra, and that each of us is like a little kind of nodule or jewel in this vast net, and that we are tied to each other through this kind of invisible threads, and that we are all mirrors that not just reflect each other, but refract each other. That we not only can see each other in each other, but we actually are transformed by being in relationship with each other. So that's the basic teaching of the jewel net of Indra, that when you can look at one jewel in that vast net, because it's a beautiful, precious mirror, it reflects all of the other jewels. And because all of the other jewels reflect all of the infinite other jewels, we can see ourselves in every other jewel, and in every other jewel we can see ourselves. In other words, that we live in this kind of community, that we're not alone. And that fundamental framework of how the world exists is the presumption of almost everything we learn in Buddhism. Because the idea is that when we shine that light onto that net, when we have the light of the Buddha, when we can have the wisdom to see things clearly, then we actually see how we are connected by these invisible threads and refracted and changed by each other. And that the Buddha taught compassion because of that interconnectedness. Compassion in the English, of course, comes from the Latin word, com, which means with, and pathos or suffering. So it means to suffer with one another. But if you look at the Japanese kanji characters for what we translate as compassion, jihi, it actually is combining two important Sanskrit words, mudita and karuna, the ability to take joy in each other's joy, and the ability to feel the suffering in each other's suffering. And that we live in this set of relationships and connections where we are supported by everyone else, but we also have the karmic responsibility to take care of all beings. And so that's why in our Buddhist tradition, for example, in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, we have such important teachings, such as in the first verse of the Shiguseigan, or the four Bodhisattva vows, it says, sentient beings are innumerable, yet we vow to liberate all. It's a powerful commentary about our set of responsibilities. We live in this infinite net where the number of sentient beings and the amount of suffering is actually innumerable. And yet we vow to liberate all, meaning that liberation, our goal, our freedom, in the words I used for the YBA gathering, is actually something that can't be achieved alone. Can't be achieved alone, but is accomplished together. So I wanted to leave you with that as the kind of basic first kind of like move, first frame of our interlinked time together this week to see how, when we look at different jewels, this week we'll be talking about things like ecology and things like social activism. We're looking at things like history and what is American Buddhism, what is America, what is ourselves. All of these things are interconnected to each other, and that if we look deep enough, hopefully we can see not only the jewel itself clearly, but we can also see all the reflections and refractions that they contain. So that's my basic goal. I have no idea if I'll do a good enough job to kind of get there, but that's the aspiration for what I hope to do. Now, in terms of today, as Dexter mentioned, our theme is the foundations of American Buddhism. And we're going to look at primarily the early decades of the establishment of Buddhism in this country. So up until World War II, so pre-war, what was important about the establishment of Buddhism? Because today we have this sense that Buddhism has become much more a part of the American religious landscape, much more a part of the, even like popular culture of America. But it wasn't always so, and the struggles and efforts of people to establish Buddhism in the early years is a really important lesson for us to be able to kind of honor our Dharma pioneers, to be able to acknowledge in that jeweled net that we are made up of all of these. It's not just about we reflect each other right now, but that we reflect many of these efforts of transmitting the Dharma to America over generations of American Buddhists that have been around since the 1850s, when the first Buddhist temples were set up by Chinese immigrants. And I want to kind of honor that history. And so that's why I'm starting today with this theme, Foundations of American Buddhism. It's also about trying to at least track a few notes along the way of what kinds of things characterize American Buddhism in contradistinction to, say, Tibetan Buddhism or Japanese Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism, etc. What's American about American Buddhism? And so we won't get to the full answer until the end of the fifth day, I think, but I want to intimate towards that. And to do that, and to understand the early years of establishment, I think we also want to kind of like get a little quick snapshot of where we are like right now. And so I thought I would try to rely on this Pew Research Center report. It's a few years old now. It's about 8 years old. It came out in 2012. But it's the latest kind of like national survey of Buddhists in America. And what it found in this longitudinal study and large-scale study was that about, among Asian Americans, about 1 in 7 of them, 14%, are Buddhist, and that Buddhism is more common in some U.S. Asian groups, such as 4 in 10 Vietnamese Americans, 1 in 4 Japanese Americans are Buddhists, 15% of Chinese Americans are Buddhists, and in their survey of groups, which was not, I was a little bit actually critical of that report because they didn't actually survey every Asian American group, but they found that no more than 6% of other major U.S. Asian groups were Buddhist, which is not true, of course, in the sense that if you look at Nepalis in America, Tibetans in America, Cambodians in America, Thai people in America, they actually have a very high percentage of their community as Buddhists. Whereas, of course, let's say Korean American, there are certain Filipino American, there are other groups that are much more Christian in terms of total percentage number in America than not. And so that was one kind of important piece of information I wanted to share with you. Another really important thing that came out of this survey, and this is why I'm starting with it, is that Asian Americans, the report says, make up a majority of U.S. Buddhists, although roughly a third of American Buddhists are non-Asian heritage. Could be Latinx or black or white or something else, but that the majority, 67 to 69%, almost 70%, majority of Buddhists in America have Asian American kind of background or heritage. That's an important finding of that report about where we are today and why we sometimes don't fully acknowledge that is something that I want to kind of get at as I talk about this history. And I know Hawaii, is Hawaii, so it has a certain kind of demographic and certain history. But this is a national story that includes places like Oklahoma and, Vermont and so forth. When we look at that whole picture, we have this very interesting moment. And I'm going to just dig into this Pew report a little bit more, as well as another Pew report in the next slide. Now, one of the things just about that issue of Asian American Buddhists, the other kind of thing that again, these are not very, very recent. They haven't been really 2019-20 kind of reports. But if we look at this data, it shows that in terms of Asian Americans and religiosity, it shows that roughly, what is this? A third of Asian Americans belong to a religious tradition different from the one in which they're raised. That's this kind of general idea. And that among Asian Americans, Hindus have the highest so-called retention rate. That most Asian Americans who are raised Hindu describe themselves as Hindu. They were born into that tradition, and over time they say they're still Hindu. That's 81%. And most of the people who don't say that say they're religiously unaffiliated. But what's interesting about Buddhists is that they're among the lowest retention rate among Asian Americans, according to this study. And that among those who are raised Buddhist, yes, 54% continue to say their religion is Buddhist, but roughly almost a third, at least over a quarter of people say they're not, they might say they're spiritual but not religious, or they use other, I'm an atheist, or I'm not religiously affiliated, is about 27%, while about 10%, 11% of the community converts to Protestant Christianity. So that's an interesting data point for us to consider as well. And finally, the survey found that 3/4 of married Asian Americans have a spouse of the same faith. So if you're a Buddhist, 3 out of 4 would have a marriage with another Buddhist, but 23% have a spouse of a different faith. And so it could be that people have this kind of interesting relationship to not only multiraciality, which has been a really important topic in Asian America. I think most of you know that in 2020, with the census, it's very likely that the roughly 1.3 million Japanese Americans that exist today are going to be tipping over to about 50%, or like a little bit over 50% of that community called Japanese America will check more than one box, meaning they will say they're Japanese American, but they'll also say they have another ethnicity in their identity composition. The other thing, though, that this survey data is showing that we can't get from the US Census is that more and more families are also existing in multi-religious situations as well. I recently have a staff member in my unit at the university that I work at. She grew up, the mom was Japanese American and the dad was Pakistani American, and she grew up going both to a Buddhist temple and a Muslim mosque. And at age 16, her dad said, you can choose which one, whatever you want to do. And she chose to be Buddhist at that age, and continues to be affiliated that way. But that's the kind of complexity that we are dealing with as a part of what is American Buddhism today. So I mentioned some of these like contemporary things before going into, the 1850s and 60s and so forth, just so that we can refract back in later points in our week together about how the past affects the present and how the present might help us to reinterpret what happened in the past. So now I'm going to try to get into the topic of the day about like the kind of early establishment of Buddhism in America. And as you can see from this thing, which is also, about a decade old in terms of the data point, we can still see that, most Buddhists today live in the Asia-Pacific region, and sometimes we therefore assume that Buddhism is an Asian religion, but that increasingly that North American number, I believe, has gone up a little bit over 4 million at this point in 2020. But the growth of Buddhism in other parts of the world is also a very important frame for us to consider as we think about American Buddhism. One of the articles I recommended for today, the introduction to this book called Issei Buddhism, it talks a lot about, in the case of the first immigrants from Japan to Hawaii and North America, how they found themselves in moments of migration and diaspora. And one of the kind of basic ideas that I tried to raise in that piece had to do with how to think about American Buddhism in conversation and relationship to this kind of global map. Meaning, Japanese immigrants also went to places like the Philippines and established Manila Hongwanji back in the pre-war days. They went to places like Korea or Vladivostok, and there's a Hongwanji temple there in Russia. What does it mean when Buddhism migrates? What does it mean to say that the Buddhist teachings move from one cultural zone to another? And how do we distinguish between something that has moved and thereby changed and compare it? Meaning, just because something changes in American Buddhism from an Asian lineage and form of Buddhism doesn't mean that it's the Americanness that changed it. If that same change happened when Buddhism went to Australia, or Buddhism went to the Philippines, or the Buddhism went to Taiwan. And so that's one of the kind of like topical things I'll be bringing up along the way of like how to be precise about thinking through what is American about American Buddhism. Now, one of the things I often like to start with when we talk about American Buddhism is what our presumptions are about what America is. And so I wanted to share this map and then a different map to help us kind of orient ourselves to the story of America and the story of American Buddhism. Now, when I came to the United States, I landed at age 17. I grew up in Japan, and I came to the United States for the first time when I was 17 years old to go to college. And it was a small liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon called Reed College. And I landed in Portland. And, one of the things when you go to Portland, Oregon, especially in the era I did, this is in the late 1980s, was the Portland Trailblazers, were an NBA basketball team that was quite a dynamic, strong team back then, and you learn about the word trailblazers. You learn about Lewis and Clark. You learn about this idea of the westward journey of pioneers and how the story and destiny of America comes from this notion that America is essentially this white and Christian nation that comes with the Pilgrims, with the Puritans, from England to New England, and how York becomes New York, and how England becomes, New England, and how they crossed the Atlantic westward, and that this westward expansion over territories that they deemed, and this is obviously not true, but they deemed uncivilized. And there's this kind of like westward story of genocide of indigenous peoples. There's the westward story and southward story of chattel slavery. There's the story of coming all the way out to the West Coast and the histories of exclusion that happens with those coming in from the Pacific coast. And then this history of going further westward towards Hawaii and the Philippines. And of course, in the case of Japanese Buddhism, we kind of often start with the story of Admiral Perry coming to Japan and the so-called opening of Japan to the West. And so there's this one story of America. And if you see this poem by George Berkeley, the British philosopher, Anglican bishop, and poet, who is the kind of namesake for the university, UC Berkeley, and the town associated with it, Berkeley, California. He writes about how, in his vision of America, and this is a poem called America, he talks about this idea of westward, the course of empire takes its way. The first of four acts already passed. A fifth shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. So there's this kind of very interesting story that's really deeply locked into the idea of America, that links it to whiteness, links it to European origins, and that links it to a certain kind of American exceptionalism and a certain kind of Christian exceptionalism as well. And it's in that context that the first Buddhists come to America, right? They first come, and their journeys to America is, of course, not a westward one, but an eastward transmission. First to Hawaii, then to the California, Washington State, and so forth. And I wanted to end this session, no, this, not session, but this our segment with this map. It's the opposite map, in a way, of what we just saw. Some of you know this term, Bukkyo Tozen. It means, if you look at the characters, it's Bukkyo means Buddhism, and Tozen means eastward, advanced. And it has to do with a prophecy that the Buddha gave just before he died, that after he dies, he won't be around to share the teachings anymore, the Dharma, but the teachings in many ways would remain, and that these teachings would be spread, would be shared with people ever eastward. And so people in years subsequent often talked about how that prophecy comes or doesn't come true. In some of the early texts of Japan, in fact, the earliest historical chronicle, the Nihon Shoki, early medieval texts also talk about how Buddhism moved from its birthplace of India through Central Asia, China, through the, also through the southern transmissions, through Korea, and finally arrived in Japan. But here's this note by one of the first bishops of the Honpa Hongwanji tradition in North America, Uchida Koyu. And he says, Hongwanji was the first Japanese Buddhist denomination to start an American mission, which in itself exemplifies the history of an eastward transmission of the Buddhist teachings, Bukkyo Tozen. This means that American Buddhists have considerable responsibilities as pioneers for spreading the teachings around the world. And what he's referring to there is this idea in that prophecy that the Dharma would be transmitted eastward and then to what they called the 10 directions around the world. And so I wanted to just stop there in kind of segment one of tonight's presentation. And I have a lot more to talk about in hour two, but I want to make sure that we have a moment to take any of your questions and reflections on the first set of comments I made about, interlinked and ideas about the jeweled net and so forth, and then this basic framework that I'm going to try to use to talk about things today. So I'm just now talking to the tech staff here. I'm going to get out of my slideshow and stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing my screen. And can be shared by Dexter.
Well, thank you, Duncan. That was great. I'm looking at my chat screen, and I don't see any questions yet from our viewers, but I do have a question that I'll hopefully, kind of encourage people to think about. When you presented the Pew Forum data, there's this concept that Sensei George Tanabe, always talks about, which is secular Buddhism. And I know that's not something that the Pew folks can collect data on, but do you have a sense from, your studies of American Buddhism, the extent of, this secular Buddhism, this spiritual feelings that are based upon, kind of Buddhist, concepts, yoga and martial arts and these sort of things as a form of an expression of American Buddhism.
Thank you for that reflection, Dexter. I'm going to get into in the second half a lot more detail about both the challenges of Asian American Buddhists in these early decades, but also, as you noted, some of the very interesting early sympathizers and converts to Buddhism and how they connected to it in various kinds of ways, such as you just suggested. So I'm happy to also forge ahead if there aren't that many questions at this point. And maybe for the next, 10 minutes, is it okay if I continue to present some materials from the PowerPoint slide and then let's take a break? Is that okay?
Sure. Whatever. I actually do have another question from Alan Hirosaki. So maybe I'll just throw this one out so that you can think about what you want to do. He says, when talking about the Western perspective view of Asian Buddhism, how much of it comes from a WASP, W-A-S-P, privilege ideology?
Okay, I'm definitely going to be talking about that. I use the word Anglo-Protestant normativity to talk about that, but that's coming up in just a moment. So maybe I'll go back to presenting and I'll try to answer Alan's interesting question as I present more material. So if it's okay with everybody, maybe I'll go for another 10 minutes or 12 minutes, something like that. and find a good moment to kind of break. And then during that break period, it would be great if folks could mull over any questions, further questions you may have for me. So tech team, is it okay if I can share my screen again and then kind of go from there to talk through that? Okay. So I want to start with, I feel like I hear an echo. Are we okay there? Okay. So I think we're good. I'm gonna share the screen again, and hopefully there won't be an echo. So as I mentioned earlier, in this kind of eastward transmission of Buddhism across the Pacific and the migration of Asian people to establish Buddhism, this history goes as far back, of course, as 1852 or the 1850s, when the first temples built by the Chinese started appearing in the United States. And it certainly met with some curiosity. I have in this slide an article published in those early years called The Chinese Buddhistic Worship in San Francisco. A lot of these Chinese enclaves that began to develop in Hawaii, in San Francisco, and elsewhere became almost points of curiosity for people in the media and so forth. But for people who were, living there, one of the most important reasons why they set up these Buddhist temples had to do with the fact that they were often migrants. They worked in different kinds of plantations, in different kinds of industries like mining, in railroads, etc. And that this disconnection with the homeland, disconnection with ancestors and their religious traditions made it important to establish temples as sanctuaries and refuges. And the Japanese were no different. 1868, the first year of Meiji, sometimes they call them the Gannen Mono because it's the Meiji Gannen, or the first year of Meiji, 1868. The migration of Buddhists to America, or at least, I'm sorry, at that time, the Kingdom of Hawaii, and then a few years later to North America, establishing Buddhist temples on the plantations as part of their communal life. Again, like the Chinese, worrying about, for example, dying in the plantation fields and having nobody to remember them. These temples and associations and communities of faith began to appear as these initially primarily male-dominated Asian communities began to find themselves establishing larger and larger numbers in Hawaii and the west coast of North America. But as I mentioned in this slide about generational Buddhism, this is a photo on your right showing a child's funeral at the Los Angeles Koyasan Buddhist temple, which is a Shingon Buddhist temple. Soon the community began to develop as families, picture brides, marriages, children. Again, in this case, children that died and need to come together. It's not just the men, but now, I don't know if you can read what's on that upper right side of that right-hand slide photo. It says Daishi Fujin Kochu, but these Fujinkai, or the women's associations, suddenly this kind of like community-based Buddhism that served multiple generations become very important to the establishment of Buddhist temples, which serve as sanctuaries for many people in a moment of dislocation. And so this is a very typical thing of immigrants, not just Asian immigrants, but Irish Catholics, or it doesn't matter what, Lutherans in Minneapolis. A lot of times the church or the temple or the synagogue or the gurdwara or the mosque became the focal point of generational and communal faith and sanctuary, where culture and religion could be shared freely. And so that's a very important kind of like establishment moment in the mid to late 19th century of first Buddhist temples and communities, sanghas, in what we call American Buddhism. But what I wanted to kind of note before we break is that it wasn't always easy because of, and this is now I'm hoping to get to Alan's question, because the framework of Manifest Destiny, the framework of an Anglo-Protestant normativity, that America was essentially a white and Christian nation, meant that they viewed Asian people, they viewed the Chinese as a racially unassimilable group and a religiously unacceptable group. And one of the slur words that started to come around in those days is the term the heathen Chinese. Heathen because it's a group that's primarily non-Christian, and this word Chinese was a kind of like a negative, a pejorative slur word used. And you can see in the publications that happened in the decades after the establishment of the first temples, establishment of the first Chinatowns, as Chinese began to get very integrated and involved in the building of America, in the building of the mines, in the building of the railroads, in the building of so much of what became America, just like in the South, the economy of the South driven so much by chattel slavery. What happens is that there becomes this fear of a migrant invasion. And so on the right-hand side, you can see this kind of like these pamphlets that raise these fears about an invasion of peoples that are going to establish, it says on this pamphlet, heathen Chinese despotism in San Francisco. And people start talking about building a Chinese wall, that's what you see on your left, around the United States. There are so many parallels to what's happening today, but on the southern border and with people of Central American, Latinx background. But that kind of language of people who are doubly foreign, doubly un-American, both racially and religiously, this is a really important kind of moment where that kind of idea of westward manifest destiny based on Christian exceptionalism and supremacy and a certain idea of what is America comes head to head with real people of non-Christian, non-white background. And these were the other kinds of images that people grew up. So on your right, this is a few years later, this is in a mainstream magazine called Harper's Weekly some years later. You see this kind of like Christian land. You see the cross above these people with, angel wing, like these protectors of a kind of Christian territory, kind of like getting prepared to battle. The note in this Harper's Weekly, the title of this illustration is The Yellow Peril. And you can see what they mean by the yellow peril. It's indicated if you look at those clouds this looming black thunderous clouds coming towards this sunlit, bright Christian land, you see the figure of the Buddha coming towards as a kind of yellow, they call it yellow peril, this idea of an invasion of race and religion that was going to overwhelm the nation. The illustration on the left is what happens when that image sticks throughout time. And this is something that's much later during World War II, but you can see the Kamakura Buddha sitting atop a tank driven by somebody in Japanese attire and like a samurai sword or something, kind of coming to invade America. And so that image stuck about what is this thing called Buddhism. It's a threat to national identity and a threat to national security. And despite that, this generational Buddhism, this kind of formative Buddhism, this idea of building a Buddhism that would serve the community, families, and different generations, Issei and Nisei, became really dynamic in both Hawaii and the west coast of the United States before the war. As I mentioned, it wasn't just men anymore. The women formed these fujinkai. The young people, both young Issei people and also new, Nisei, the second generation, formed these YBAs that I mentioned at the very top of today's talk, going to Sunday school or Dharma school to have this kind of transmission of the Dharma, education about what is Buddhism, education about what is a broader religio-cultural tradition. And that became the basis of much controversy. And so what I want to do, because I know that some people need, we've reached the 1 hour spot. So I know we need to take a 10-minute break, but what I want to do is when we come back, talk about what happens in the growth of Buddhism and when it meets Christian Manifest Destiny. And I'm going to go through some other slides that deal with, for example, Buddhism and the struggle for racial equality through the sugar plantation strikes in Hawaii, the struggle for or providing an alternate vision for what is America through the Supreme Court cases around the Japanese language schools that present a challenge to that idea of Anglo-Protestant normativity. Anglo, both in the sense of whiteness, but also in the sense of English only, as the kind of basic understanding of what makes America America, and how Buddhists are engaging in the public square a different vision of what is America, and how that's so important to the formation of American Buddhism. And if you read the recommended reading by Noriko Asato for today, this part will make extra sense to you. And so I'm going to come to touch on those topics, as well as end with some of the themes that was brought out in another recommended reading by Thomas Tweed about what I'm now going to call the Westward movement of Buddhism, about sympathy and conversion, sympathizers and converts to Buddhism of non-Asian American heritage. I'm going to be talking about people like Madame Blavatsky. I'm going to be talking about Sir Edwin Arnold and Paul Carus, about Thoreau and Emerson. And I'm going to try to touch on these people as well, because they, while they're not in the majority of people who make up American Buddhism then or now, they do have an important role to play in making up something called American Buddhism as well. So I want to get to that after the break. And so let's take 10 minutes to do that. I'm going to quit out of my slideshow again and go back to Dexter and see if he can kind of give us some guidance about how we're going to come back after the break. Dexter, I think.
I forgot to unmute. Thank you very much. Hopefully I'm live now on microphone. Thank you, Duncan, very much for a wonderful first session. And the break will be refreshments on your own. And you have 10 minutes, so we'll reconvene at 6:15. And we'll see you then. So we'll leave it to the studio to take us to, our shakuhachi music. Well, aloha, and thank you for coming back. I'm getting some echo. So, okay, thank you. uh, hopefully you had, terrific refreshments. Traditionally at the Buddhist Study Center, at summer sessions, we have a very generous kind of buffet going, and it builds and builds throughout each night. So, everybody please try to keep up that tradition at home. Our current count for viewers is 135. So thank you very much for dialing in from all over the Hawaiian Islands and the mainland, and I believe also outside of the U.S. also. So thanks a lot, and we'll return it to Duncan for part 2. And again, remember to post your questions in the YouTube chat, and we will try to convey them to Duncan so he can consider addressing them. Okay, so back to Duncan. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I think we're back from the break, and I hope you had a moment to go to the restroom, get some refreshments. I'm missing the wonderful buffets of these traditional summer seminars in Hawaii with the refreshments. But here we are, we're back, and in the second hour, what I want to do is to talk about antipathy and sympathy in the other flow that we were talking about from what we were talking about in the first hour, that eastward flow of Buddhism from Chinese and Japanese immigrants to America, that there were reactions to that, both sympathetic ones, but also those with some antipathy. And so I'm going to start with the antipathy first and talk about, as you can see on this slide, the Buddhism and the politics of exclusion. You can see that early on, it's not just that there are these conversations that I mentioned earlier about Anglo-Protestant normativity and about America is foundationally a white Christian nation, that it's also that Buddhism is seen as an actual threat to America, not just that it doesn't fit into this image of America, but that it's an actual threat. And so, and we know that from documents like this one that you see on your screen from 1918. This is the Office of Naval Intelligence report that says Buddhist priests in Hawaii, while ostensibly loyal to the United States, are in reality doing everything in their power to undermine any American allegiance entertained by the Japanese in Hawaii. That kind of like national security threat assessment of Buddhism as un-American was taken on in many political campaigns, both in California as well as in Hawaii, where politicians, for example, this other quote, and you see this kind of campaign poster of Senator James Phelan that reads, "Save our state from Oriental aggression, keep California white, re-elect James Phelan." He actually served as the head of the Committee on Immigration and Naturalization, in which the main report, the conclusion of the report, in which he talks about 76 Buddhist temples in California attended by so-called emperor worshippers, and that this is a threat to America because they believe that the emperor is the overlord of all. This type of language became very common in that period from the 1910s and 10s and 20s, in part because as Buddhists and Asian American communities, as in what I talked about in the first hour, began to form these communal temples and Japantowns and Chinatowns and ethnic communities that served as places of sanctuary and refuge for people and their faith, the reaction to that was one of fear. And if we go to this slide, we hear this language, you can see here, this language of Christianize and Americanize, that California was given to God by white people, and so on and so forth. And in Hawaii, in that period, like around 1920 or so, the newspapers and the conversation in the political halls of power used this terminology of the repaganization of the islands. It was this idea that because white Christian missionaries had so-called Americanized the islands by converting native Hawaiians to Christianity, the fact that this growing group of second-generation Japanese Americans who didn't abandon their Buddhist faith but continued to increase in number of the number of what people considered this kind of threat to American identity and national security, that the islands were being re-paganized. So that was the context in which the bishop of Hawaii, Hongwanji, Imamura Emyo, said the following in 1918.
Share your screen.
I'm sorry?
Share your screen.
Oh, is it not sharing?
No. There you go.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize that wasn't sharing. So by the way, this was the image of what I was talking about a moment ago. And then now I just want to take a look at this quote from Bishop Imamura Emyo, in which he said, "We live in America and we must have political allegiance and observe its laws. However, a polemicist argues that Americanization means spiritual servility, and that true Americanization is to forsake Japanese religion and thoughts and adopt those of America. This contradicts the founding spirits of America. America esteems freedom, equality, and independence, spiritual independence to the utmost. It never asks for spiritual servility." It's a really interesting comment by a Buddhist leader in a year like 1918, where he is asserting a place, claiming a place for Buddhism in America based on those fundamental ideas about religious freedom written into the U.S. Constitution. And he's saying, he talks about this polemicist that argues that to become truly American, you need to become Christian. And in the debates that happened during that period in American Buddhism, in vis-a-vis American or Japanese American Christianity, was that there were those in the Christian community who were telling the Buddhists, they used the term naimen teki doka and gaimen teki doka. Naimen teki doka meaning internal assimilation versus gaimen teki doka, or external assimilation. And so what they said was, look, Buddhists like Bishop Imamura Emyo might be externally assimilating to America by building the type of temple buildings and meeting on Sundays in a congregationalist manner, and otherwise accommodating and assimilating to what they find themselves surrounded externally in America, putting pews in Buddhist temples, creating Buddhist sambutsuka or Buddhist hymns that could be accompanied by organ music so that it looks externally like a Christian service, but until you internally convert to Christianity, you can't be a real American. And so that's what Bishop Imamura is tackling, is that it's not just white supremacists in political positions of political power in the halls of the U.S. Senate, like Senator Phelan, but rather there were also people in the Japanese American community itself who were saying to really become American, you have to internally assimilate to Christianity. And so the idea of kind of pushing back against that finds its actualization in two very interesting moments in this period before World War II. The first has to do with the sugar plantation strikes. And if you take a look at this slide, you can see different moments of Issei immigrants working in the sugar plantations. You can see pictures of the early strikes in the early parts of the 1900s, and people going to jail because of their political activism to try to get equal pay for equal work. It was a very important movement, and of course, the large strikes that happened later, 1919, and 20s, the labor strikes for equal freedom, of equal pay for not dependent on race. And what you see in the bottom right-hand slide is, I think, this very fascinating picture. One of the biggest rallies that happened in Honolulu around the sugar plantation strikes that those of you in Hawaii, I think, already know, quite a bit about, that they were important struggles for labor and racial equality. But what you see here is a group of young Buddhists, people belonging to the Soto Zen Buddhist YBA, or Young Buddhist Association, marching in the thousands in the streets of Honolulu, walking for equal pay for across the races, not only proclaiming their Buddhistness, but also, if you look at the middle of that rally, you see this massive portrait of Abraham Lincoln that they're carrying, linking and interlinking their struggle for fair pay and racial equality with this symbol of American emancipation, Lincoln. And so you see these type of moves that someone like Bishop Imamura is making, these young Buddhists are making in their labor struggle. And finally, in this case in 1927, this U.S. Supreme Court case in which Buddhists are also arguing for a place that isn't assimilating into that Anglo-Protestant normativity, that question that came up earlier that Alan mentioned. They are saying it's not just that America is a place of the free for white and Christian people, but if you speak, a language other than English, if you practice a faith other than Christianity, we belong too. And if you read the article that was assigned for today, the Noriko Asato article, you'll see some of these quotes that's on the screen today about how the superintendent of public instruction in Hawaii at that time, Yvonne McCockney, would talk about these questions of how Buddhist schools are superstitious shrines for Mikado worship. And as long as 95% of the Japanese in Hawaii remain Buddhist, so long would Americanization be retarded. And what that kind of stance in the public square meant was that all of these bills, the Judd's bill, the Andrews bill, the Clark bill, the things you might have read in the readings for today, they come up through the Hawaii Territorial Legislature to try to control and ultimately destroy the Japanese language schools. And Albert Judd, for whom one of the bills is named, a grandson of one of the important early Christian missionaries to the islands, he used the words that he he reflected on his motivation for why these language schools needed to be closed down by saying that it's for the nation to safeguard a Christian American citizenship in the territory. And so with all these laws being passed by the territorial government, what do? Led by bishops, the one I mentioned earlier, Imamura of the Nihonganji, Hosen Isobe of the Soto Zen tradition, Shinkyo Tachikawa of the Jodoshu tradition, and the majority of these language schools took on this case in a Supreme Court case that came to be known as Farrington versus Tokushige. And ultimately, it goes through the Ninth Circuit and goes to the Supreme Court, and the federal government, or not the government, the federal judiciary makes a determination that these territorial bans on Japanese language schools is actually unconstitutional. So that's a really big win for Buddhists in America in the year 1927. So I mentioned these things as the backdrop of this antipathy towards Buddhism and the agency that Buddhists themselves had to kind of carve out a place for themselves in Hawaii, in California, and elsewhere as they began to build these temples. And so what I want to do now is shift a little bit towards talking about, well, what about sympathy and even further, conversion? If you read Thomas Tweed's piece for tonight in the readings, this article called Nightstand Buddhists and Other Creatures, Sympathizers, Adherents to the Study of Religion. In that book, he talks about people who occupy this space that isn't quite, self-identified converts or adherents to Buddhism, but these people who are so-called sympathizers to Buddhism. They may not formally claim themselves to be Buddhists, but they're involved in Buddhism. This is a very important thing to study in this late 19th century, in this very period of antipathy towards Buddhism, because it shows that there's there's multiple layers and trends that are going on at the same time. And in that article, he makes some suggestions about how to understand people who are sympathizers, how to understand people who are adherents, and he proposes this idea of self-identification. If somebody says that they're Buddhist, we should count them as being people that are part of something called American Buddhism. So it's an interesting suggestion that actually has some relevance when we come back later in, I think, day 4 and 5, when we talk about more contemporary moments. Who belongs? Who constitutes what is American Buddhism? It's an important kind of framework that he provides. And the other framework is it's in the same book, but it's and the slide doesn't say exactly who it is. It's a sociologist called William Coleman, but he, in his article called The New Buddhism, talks about what it takes for these sympathizers to actually become full-on advocates, adherents, converts to Buddhism. And he talks about this thing called the push and pull factor. And what he means by that is that when we talk about sympathy and conversion, when somebody moves from one religious tradition to so-called convert to another, there has to be certain things that they are dissatisfied with, that they're being pushed out of whatever tradition that they may have been born into or associated with at a certain earlier point in their life. And that when people are being pushed away from their family, tradition or what they're born into or whatever, it could be that they become non-religious. But for them to actually become sympathizers or to go as far as to convert to another religion, there has to be other factors that are so-called pull factors, things that look interesting, attractive, compelling, that pull them into a different faith tradition. And again, I want to kind of go back to Tweed. In Tweed's kind of bigger book that goes beyond the readings we did for today, he actually gives a kind of typology, 3 different styles of sympathizing, adhering, and converting that he finds in the late 19th century. And he divides them between people he calls esoteric/occultist, number 2, rationalist/scientific, and number 3, romantic/ people who are attracted to Buddhism as a kind of exotic culture. And it's curious that he identifies those 3 groupings back then, because in many ways we can still see some of those typologies even in the 21st century American Buddhism. But let me go through this in a little bit more care by looking through at a couple of particular examples before I end this segment to take your questions. But I want to kind of start getting into that by looking at this slide that I think contains this important moment in American Buddhist history as we think about today's topic of foundations. It's a set of photos, as you can see, from the 1893 World Parliament of Religions held in Chicago. And you can see, I call it the Dharma presence on the global stage, but you can see people like Swami Vivekananda from India representing Hinduism. You can see Anagarika Dhammapala from Sri Lanka representing Buddhism from that region of the Buddhist world. And you can see the names, I listed them, Shakusoen, the Japanese Rinzai Zen Buddhist, Toki Horyu, the Shingon Buddhist, Ashitsuji Zen, the Tendai Buddhist, and the Yatsubushi Bunryu, the Jodo Shinshu, Honpa Hongwanji Buddhist, who are attending as delegates and representatives of Buddhism on this kind of global interface stage. It's an important moment that because of these sympathizers and converts, you'll see that these names will come up again and again and again in the kind of first wave, let's say, of convert Buddhism. So among the 2 people I really want to talk about for the rest of the time here are Anagarika Dhammapala from Sri Lanka. He's a lay person. He is celebrated in the Chicago press of that time, and actually the national press of that time, as a very eloquent speaker and representative of Buddhism who explained Buddhism on that world stage in a very succinct way. And the other person that gets in the press a lot is this Japanese Buddhist representative, Shakusoen. And his speech was translated by the young D.T. Suzuki, who actually later becomes such an important figure in the growth of, not only American, but Western interest in general around that tradition of Zen Buddhism. But Shakusoen's translator is D.T. Suzuki, and Shakusoen becomes very involved in the transmission of Buddhism to America writ large, especially amongst this group of sympathizers and converts. And so if I go to the next slide, this is a very important conversion that, of course, happens in Hawaii. Those of you associated with Honpa Hongwanji, I think know the name of Mary Foster well. She met Anagarika Dhammapala when he was returning to Sri Lanka and learned meditation and Buddhist principles from him, and ultimately became a major benefactor to the Mahabodhi Society in Sri Lanka. So she's celebrated there. And of course, she's also associated with native Hawaiian associations with the Queen and so on and so forth, and is a very prominent individual in Honolulu society at that time. And so, and of course, connected to the Honpa Hongwanji, she's the person that donated the land along the Pali Highway for building the Honpa Hongwanji mission as well. So she's somebody who is, again, somebody who straddles that line between sympathizer and convert. She's not a fully involved member as a kind of a Buddhist Sangha member in that sense, but very much a sympathizer and adherent in a certain way with this early Buddhist movement. Another early female convert to Buddhism, and this is actually a convert, is Madame Blavatsky and her colleague, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. They are the founders of this movement called the Theosophical Society, and in terms of formal conversion, in other words, taking the precepts and the vows, they both go to Sri Lanka, again, this Dharmapala connection, and they recite the precepts and become the first U.S. Converts to Buddhism. Olcott is very important. Again, like Foster, he becomes very important in Sri Lanka, in part because he is very much involved with the kind of pushback against British colonialism, the pushback against the Christianizing of the Sri Lankan islands, and his idea that the printing press would be a really important tool for Buddhist modernism. And he publishes a book called The Buddhist Catechism in 1881, which is this really curious text that has this kind of like, as catechisms do, this kind of like creedal, like what is the creed of Buddhism? What's the essence of Buddhism? And sometimes in this kind of question and answer type of like format, which go on to influence Japanese liturgical texts and Sri Lankan catechisms as well, as of course, in Japan, in the Meiji period, they begin to make these kind of collections of like, what's the essence of Buddhism? What's the kind of sacred texts of Buddhism? Let's put them into a single book, like the Christians have their Bible. Let's have a Buddhist Bible, that kind of idea. And of course, this becomes a really important part of Honpa Hongwanji, and as well as Japanese American Buddhism in general. When you look at the kinds of liturgical texts and that come out in the early part of the 1900s, it's very much influenced by this early Buddhist catechism by Henry Steele Olcott. And I mentioned D.T. Suzuki earlier. In fact, Suzuki and his white American wife, Beatrice Lane Suzuki, organized what's called the Mahayana Lodge of the Theosophical Society in Kyoto, and become early. So it's this weird thing of like Japanese Buddhists are converting all these, and then Sri Lankans are converting other people, and then these Americans are then reconverting Japanese people. It's this very interesting kind of moment of global exchange and conversion. But I mentioned Blavatsky and Olcott and Theosophy because it's a good example of Tweed's first category that he mentioned of the occult and the esoteric. The Theosophy was this basic idea that you could gain theos and wisdom and knowledge and understanding from this kind of mystical tradition. And of course, this is the style of Buddhism that also becomes very important in the arrival in later decades of Tibetan Buddhism in America. But this idea of kind of lamas with secret knowledge, esoteric knowledge, this is the kind of stream of American Buddhism that would ultimately be very influential in making people like the Dalai Lama and other Rinpoches and Tibetan teachers very acceptable to American society. Was the groundwork laid by these people in these early decades. The second category that Tweed gives us in the readings we did and his other writings is this idea of the rational scientific form of Buddhism. And the two people that most exemplify that is Sir Edwin Arnold and Paul Carus. Arnold, he's a British poet and essayist. He wrote a lot about Buddhism in Japan, but he becomes most famous because of this 1879 book that goes through many multiple reprintings. It becomes this bestseller in Boston and New York. It's #1 on the book charts of that time, called Light of Asia. And it's basically in kind of like a Victorian style, retelling the life of the Buddha. And this is one of the ways in which high society, they call them Boston Brahmins, but the kind of high society of the East Coast people first learn about the life of the Buddha is through this popular text called The Light of Asia. Arnold continues to go on to write books about Japan. In a little bit later, 1891, he writes Sea and Lands and Japonica, two important books, early books, popular books about Japan. And he lived in Japan during that time. His second wife, Tama Kurokawa, was Japanese. And again, this person, Anagarika Dharmapala, the person that Mary Foster in Hawaii was related to, he, together with Dharmapala, ends up being another supporter of the Mahabodhi Society, but not the one in Sri Lanka, but in India. And so he's another very interesting figure that's interconnected between Sri Lanka, Hawaii, Japan, and all of these new things that are going on. But he was very much in this kind of like more rational scientific form of attraction to Buddhism as a form of Buddhism that they argued was rational, was scientific, appropriate for the age of reason and science, unlike Christianity. And that's how they kind of discuss Buddhism. And the other person, Paul Karras, was probably the most fierce proponent of that style. He was a German-American philosopher and advocate of something, what he called the religion of science. And he ran a publishing company called Open Court, and he was the editor-in-chief of a journal called The Monist, which is quite influential, especially among transcendentalists and theosophists and other people that look to panentheism and monism as a philosophy. He was author of about 75 books, including another widely sold book called The Gospel of the Buddha. He had Shakusoin, again, going back to the 1893 World Parliament of Religions, the main Japanese Zen Buddhist representative. He had Shakusoin write the foreword to it, and actually is connected to D.T. Suzuki by housing him. Suzuki lived with Paul Karras in Illinois for some years, and Karras kind of financially supported Suzuki to sponsor his translation of the Tao Te Ching, the outlines of Mahayana Buddhism, and other important texts that Suzuki translated from classical Chinese and Japanese into English. And so these people are kind of curiously associated with these Asian and Asian American peoples, and are representing certain kind of impulses and strands of American Buddhism, in this case, the so-called rational and scientific one. The last thing I'll mention before kind of stopping and asking for your questions is this kind of like romanticized or romantic nature Buddhist type of, the people who, like Henry Thoreau living in Walden, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, people who copied the Bhagavad Gita, who translated the Lotus Sutra, an important Mahayana Buddhist text, from the French version for the Transcendentalist magazine, The Dial. These kind of intellectuals who, again, probably never met an actual, in the case of Blavatsky and Karras, and they actually knew, live Buddhists. But in the case of people like Thoreau and Emerson, there was what Tweed calls these kind of like nightstand Buddhists, people who associated with Buddhism primarily through books that they had on their nightstand. So people like Thoreau and Emerson were in that category of people who lived out on the East Coast, who had very little contact with actual Asian people, never went to Asia or anything, but who, through books, through translations, found a sympathy for Buddhism. And so I wanted to kind of like end there and talk, and those are kind of my examples of the people that Thomas Tweed in the article we read for today kind of like outlines as important streams in the creation and the establishment of early Buddhism. Today I try to talk about this kind of book Buddhism and this kind of like people who are sympathizers and adherents coming from the East Coast and kind of contributing that way towards and moving in that traditional map that we saw early on in today's talk of going westward. And then all of these Asian American Buddhists struggling through antipathy, struggling through political, media, legislative kind of community pressures to feel like they don't belong, to feel that they're not American, and claim a space for Buddhism. That those two streams are merging in many different interesting ways in these early decades of American Buddhism. And that's where I want to kind of leave it for my presentation and see if you have questions for the remaining time of our first evening's seminar. So I'm going to hand things back over to Dexter and see if he can ask some questions.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. That historical perspective was quite fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers, are not familiar, with the early, days of Buddhism, especially the nightstand Buddhism, aspect of it that kind of predates the secular Buddhism that I had mentioned about that George Tanabe and BDK America are curious about and trying to focus on. I'm waiting for questions to come in, but I was just thinking back on the original Pew data that you talked about and how Buddhist families don't tend to transfer the Buddhist concepts to their children. It's like 25%, whereas the Christians 75% of kids seem to continue to be within that same religion, and I'm thinking that maybe Buddhism presented to our children seems to be too esoteric. The early Buddhist, like you were saying, it's rational, it's scientific, but what appeals to children is kind of simpler than that, and I think I'd like you to maybe comment on how the Hunt and his wife Dorothy kind of created a kind of a simple view of Buddhist principles and the golden chain of love. And I think many of our seniors today still remember the Hunts and the simple, kind of sayings of the golden chain of love as what they, kind of remember, when they're asked, what is Buddhism, to them. So this dichotomy between, too rational and scientific, versus the, kind of the more softer or emotional appeal of what is Buddhism, that the Ernest and Dorothy Hunt, kind of portrayed, in the early days of Buddhism here in Hawaii. And I'll keep an eye on the question stream.
Okay, great. Am I back on? Is that okay? Okay. Are we good? Okay. So, one of the, I was going to reserve Ernest Hunt and Dorothy Hunt for tomorrow because we're going to be talking about Buddhism in Hawaii during the World War II, and Hunt was such an important figure in that moment as well. But Dexter, since you bring him up and his wife up now, there are these people in Hawaii as well as elsewhere, like Sunya Pratt. For some reason, there's a lot of them who happen to be English or British, who have become converts. They naturalize as Americans, but also they convert to Buddhism. There's quite a few of them in this early period, and the Hunts are a great example of that category of person who not only converts but becomes an active enough member of the Sangha that they either convert fully and also go one step beyond that and actually ordain as a Buddhist priest and take on that role, or in the case of Dorothy Hunt, take on the role of writing liturgical, music and song as a way to convey the Dharma. And Dexter, as you were saying, there's a lot of things about the kind of need for, I think the way you put it was simplicity, but the need to explain the Dharma in ways that would translate over community, language, and generation. So it wasn't just about trying to find a universal language, which of course was a big thematic in the late 19th century. This idea of kind of like, are there religions that are particularized, or are there religions that are universal? And Buddhism tending to take that stance. Buddhism is a religion that is universal. It's not dependent on, race, culture, background, etc. It's open to all. That kind of idea of universality was something that, everyone from Shak Soen to Ernest Hunt was saying. So it's certainly a moment when that was a key kind of idea of saying Buddhism is universal in the same way that Christianity is universal, and therefore has an equal standing too. So that was an important kind of interfaith position that Buddhism took at that time. But in terms of kind of the simplicity, it had to do with how do you transmit Buddhism from one language, one cultural specificity to not only people who may not have that background, like the Hunts. I think they were thinking of conversion of other people similar to themselves, but also transmitting to the next generation. And when they started, along with Bishop Imamura, the whole English department at Honpa Hongwanji, and try to have a way to not only do the Japanese language school side, to have an ability of parents and children to communicate with each other, but have this English department where the Nisei or the second generation could learn, in English in ways that were appropriate to young people. And the development of the whole Sunday school or Dharma school is obviously connected to that. But that's a very important kind of, what we want to call it, familial and generational form of Buddhism that many people are finding really important, even like right now. When Buddhism becomes very privatized and kind of like it's all about yourself, and it has nothing to do with community, family, transmission across generations, and so forth. What happens is that sanghas that are based on that, as they develop and mature over time, just like the temples did in Hawaii, they come to realize there is a need to be able to transmit across generations, across families, and so on and so forth. And so it's a very interesting moment to study what the Hunts did, what Bishop Imamura did back in those days before the war. And tomorrow, in my presentation about Buddhism in Hawaii during World War II, I'll be referring a lot more to that.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. We do have one question. I think you might be able to see it on your chat.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I see the question here. It says, it's a question asking about the formation of the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, and what's the background to that formation. And so maybe today we could end with this. That's a great question. The World Parliament was actually only one small part of a much larger exposition or World's Fair that was taking place in, it was called the Columbian Exposition, but it was held in Chicago to celebrate, as those expos did at that time and thenceforth, the achievements of the host country. And so this was it was an important moment for America to, in this expo, showcase its new technology, it's the railroads that had come together, the steam engines, and all the different things that they were showcasing technologically. They wanted to balance that with achievements in civilization and culture. And America, as a still relatively young nation, wanted to do this massive kind of like showcase of what it meant to be American and what it meant to be at the leading edge of technology and culture and civilization. And so that was the context of the Chicago World's Fair and Exposition, in which they decided to also showcase American religion in the kind of white Protestant version of it, almost trying to suggest in this World Parliament that yes, there are world's religions, and we are inviting them to come to assemble in Chicago, but for the purpose of showing that the word that was used by the World Parliament Chairman William Barrows was that there are lights in the world, that these different religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, have some truth and light in them, but that the greatest light was the light of Christ. And so it was supposed to be the showcase of the pinnacle of the world's religions being Christianity, and that the pinnacle of Christianity being not the old world Christianity of Europe and of Catholicism and so forth, but the Protestant American version of Christianity as this kind of greatest light. So that was the intention of the organizers of that gathering. But what Dharmapala and Vivekananda and Soen Shaku did was they subverted the purpose of that gathering and started to claim that they were on equal footing with Christians, and did this in a way as to spark entire movement of American Buddhism. And so that was one of the real interesting reasons why that moment, 1893, was a really key moment in American Buddhist life.
Great. Well, thank you, Duncan, for that final comment for this evening. I see that there were some other comments coming across, but we can try to touch on those tomorrow night. And tomorrow night, in your the syllabus, which is available at the Buddhist Study Center website, the topic will be Buddhism in Hawaii during World War II. So, and the readings are in chapters 1 and 2 of American Sutra. So, if you, if you have a copy of that, please, take a look. And otherwise, thank you so much for attending our first night of the summer session, and with a great gathering of folks from all over. And thank you, Duncan, for your presentation and participation. It was terrific. And also thanks to the crew in the studio, for, we made it happen, and we'll have a chance to do it again tomorrow night. So, we'll be looking forward to seeing everyone again, same time, same place. Bring your, your favorite snack and join us. Thank you and good night.